Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us for today's Front Engineers London event with Will. Let me introduce myself first of all. My name is Abby. I work with Front Engineers London and the other 15 plus communities, all of which are free and run by RecWorks. We are a tech recruitment company with a big difference. So as a recruitment company, obviously, we're always on the lookout for more clients, and some of our best clients have actually come from community members who recommended RecWorks to their internal talent teams. So if you're hiring for a new team or you're working for a company that is, please do get in touch with me. My name is as it appears on the screen. You can find me on Twitter, LinkedIn or Slack. And we really look forward to having that conversation with you. So what's the difference, I hear you ask? Well, as a company as well, we also believe that recruitment really can be a force for good in the industry beyond just placing people in jobs. We have a particular focus on learning, mentoring, and personal development. If people want to learn and others want to teach or share their knowledge, we are more than happy to connect you through our communities and events. We see this as giving back to those we've worked with in the past, but also paying it forward to those we hope to work with in the future. Earlier this year, we made our 4,000th introduction through our Meet a Mentor community, and we're really excited about that and looking forward to making our 5,000th introduction. As I've already said, we love to give opportunities for people to connect, and this event today is part of that. If you would like to know more about any of our communities, again, please do get in touch with me or Helen Lewis or Barry if you know either of them, and we can take it from there. Today's session is being recorded for you, and I will put the link to the YouTube channel in the chat as we go along today. If you have any questions while Will is speaking, please do save them for the end. There will be time for Q&A, and we'd love to have some discussion after he's finished speaking. And so with no further ado, over to you, Will.
Awesome. Thank you, Abby. Yeah, hello, and thanks everyone for joining today's talk on OAuth Essentials for Frontenders. I'll briefly introduce myself. So as Abby mentioned, my name is Will Bishop. I'm a senior developer advocate at Miro, which is an online visual collaboration platform. And specifically, I work on our developer platform, so extending the power of Miro via our APIs and SDKs. But I'm super passionate about all things API related and OAuth especially. So I'm really excited to kind of share some of my learnings over the better half of the last decade, working at organizations like Miro and Zoom and a few others, and distill what I consider the essentials of OAuth for you today. So yeah, with that, if you're joining us today, you've most likely either wanted to or needed to perhaps think about OAuth in some capacity, or if not, that's quite all right as well. Hopefully you'll learn a thing or two today. So in any case, you won't be surprised to hear that OAuth 2.0 is one of the most commonly dreaded authorization methods to implement in front-end development, with its various flows, its token exchanges, and other intricacies. And it can be a bit of a headache at times. But it's also an essential authorization flow that opens the door to a seemingly unlimited number of third-party use cases. So in the next 30 minutes, I'm going to lay down some of the essentials for us to be able to start incorporating OAuth into front-end projects of our own and start leveraging third-party services with a bit more confidence. Before we dive in, just quickly highlight a few of the learnings for today. So first, we'll cover OAuth's role in front-end development and why it's valuable in front-end development specifically. We'll walk through the various OAuth flows or grant types, as you'll hear them referred to, and then we'll master the authorization code specifically. We're going to put all of this in a front-end context, and then we'll generate an access token for use with the REST API. So that's just a quick sneak peek. But yeah, let's jump in. So what exactly is OAuth, and why does it matter in front-end development? Well, OAuth is the industry standard protocol for authorization when it comes to making REST API calls. And OAuth 2.0 is the latest generation of this authorization method. So it makes sense then that if we want to bring external or third-party technologies into any of our applications on behalf of our app's end users, we'll need a way to be granted this permission. And that's exactly where OAuth 2.0 comes in. So even in front-end development, we might be tasked with a way to incorporate some of our users' favorite tools like Zoom, Miro, Google, what have you. So let's start with a basic example from a front-end perspective. Here we have the landing page of a virtual collaboration platform called Butter. Maybe you're familiar with it, perhaps not, but we can see just from the screenshot here of the Butter UI that it's a fun, visual platform with seemingly a lot of emphasis on the front end. But actually, aside from this, it's a tool that incorporates and integrates several other platforms and services on behalf of its own end users, essentially bringing lots of great separate tools into one easy UI. And taking a closer look, you can see some of these logos for some of our favorite tools. For instance, I see the Miro logo in there. If we go into a workspace in Butter, we'll see other examples. So here we take a closer look and we can see the login with Google option. So most likely you've seen the login with Google option lots of other places. But in this context, it's a great example, I think, of a platform, Butter in this instance, bringing the power of one of Google's best tools, Google Calendar, right into its own UI and experience. So when you click on the login with Google option from the UI, you're probably aware you're going to enter the Google OAuth authorization flow as an end user, granting permission to Butter to pull details from your Google Calendar and bring them directly into Butter's platform. So this is, a great example of, how seamlessly OAuth 2.0 can enable us to bring amazing third-party capabilities right into our own apps. So with this in mind, we're really starting to see why mastering OAuth 2.0 could be so valuable in front-end development. And in this sense, I think it's really more than just an authorization method. It's really a launch pad for bringing more external capabilities into your apps that actually, complement the native ones that you've already built. So let's take it a little bit further. So now that we've kind of, set the scene and we have a better sense of the value in OAuth in front-end development, I want to dig into some of the essentials and start building a bit of a technical foundation. But first, a couple of reminders. Remember that for OAuth, a lot of the bulk of the authorization flow is handled on the backend or the server, with the exception of the end user triggering the flow from the front end, which we'll cover shortly. And also keep in mind that a lot of secure sites and services may not permit cross-origin resource sharing or CORS, as you've probably heard it called. This is less and less of an issue these days, but it's still something that can come up. So keep in mind that any requests that you send to an OAuth endpoint or another REST endpoint, should come from your backend typically. So with these 2 points in mind, let's jump into some of the OAuth nitty-gritty. So I'm not going to read through this, chart end to end because it's a lot of information, but I just want to demonstrate that there are various different flows or grant types in OAuth. And while there are a number of them, we're not going to focus on all of them today, but it's just important to know that they exist. And also to know that, some flows are more common than others. That said, generally, they all share the basic, same fundamentals of OAuth, which is that they primarily include these 4 components. So first, there's a resource owner. This is the entity that owns the data in the resource server. So for example, a Google account owner is the resource owner of their account. Next, we have the resource server. So this is essentially the OAuth term for the API that stores data that an application wants to access. So using the same example, this would be like a Google-owned API. Then we have the client. This is your app. This is the thing that is requesting access to some kind of data. And lastly, we have the authorization server. This is the OAuth magic. This is like the main apparatus that allows us to use the OAuth flow. All right, so we've covered these components of OAuth and mentioned that there are a lot of different flows or grant types that can be leveraged, but which one should we use and in which case? Well, ultimately, this depends on your exact use case and the needs of your application, your end users, and probably the infrastructure available to you. But for the purposes of covering the essentials from a front-end perspective, we are focusing primarily on, the most common flows. So most likely you'll see, this top few here referenced for OAuth quite often, the authorization code flow, and perhaps in the past, the implicit grant flow. So the implicit grant flow is a bit of a legacy flow now. I'm showing it here since you may still see it referenced, but it's not really a recommended flow to use anymore. For some context, this flow previously, it had an access token that was included in a redirect URL directly without any kind of exchange, which is a bit less secure. I'll talk about this a little bit more later on, but just to kind of mention it for now. And since the authorization code flow is one of the most commonly used and also one of the more secure flows, this is the one we're going to consider recommended for, incorporating into our front-end applications in today's demo. So with that in mind, let's start diving into the authorization code flow specifically. All right, so we're going to go through the different steps of the authorization code flow, from a high level, and then we'll kind of dig into it a bit more granularly. So this starts with the end user authorizing your application. This is followed by an exchange of an authorization code for an access token. Once you retrieve an access token, this can be used to make a request to a REST API. And after you've made a request to a REST API, you can then actually request a new access token using a refresh token. So, these steps are a helpful high-level overview, but let's take it one step further. So here we see the detailed steps of the OAuth flow broken down between our end user, our application, and the resource owner. In this example, we're using Miro, but this could be Google, this could be Zoom, this could be any resource. So this is a lot of information though, right? It's kind of hard to look at. Let's take it step by step. So in the authorization code flow, the first step is our app will construct an authorization or installation URL. This is how our OAuth flow will be kicked off to the end user in the UI. So when we direct our end user to this URL, they're presented with an authorization screen. So this will be some kind of consent screen like you see here, where it asks, do you want to grant permission, like install, authorize, something along those lines. It can vary depending on the resource owner, but generally they all look a bit similar. And then the next step is that the user accepts this prompt, authorizing your app, and then they're redirected to your app's callback URL. This callback URL will contain an authorization code parameter, and your app will exchange that for an access token. And the access token is what will be used to actually authorize the request to the REST API. So once the access token is used, you can request a new access token using the refresh token that was actually returned alongside of the access token that you got in step 3. Again, this is a lot of information, so we're going to go through it in a functional example in a moment, but this is to just kind of give us a high-level sense of the interactions between the end user, your app, and a resource owner. But yeah, it's quite a lot, so let's put this into context with a functional example. So just to recap so far, we've spent a bit of time looking at the authorization code flow from end to end, but in order to contextualize it a bit more from a front-end development perspective, let's check out a real example. And more specifically, let's start from the very beginning at the moment where the OAuth flow is initiated by an end user from the UI of a web app. So here we have a very basic front-end UI built in a NextJS application. And as we can see, we've got just a white screen with a sign-in button. You can use your imagination to picture something a bit more creative, perhaps something like Butter. But the idea is, there's a basic sign-in here. And once the end user clicks the sign-in button, this is going to kick off the OAuth flow, and they'll be directed to authorize your app. But before we show what that looks like on the front end, I want to talk about what this looks like on the back end. So in this example, we're using Miro, and you can see that our app here is constructing an authorization URL based on a Miro client ID and a redirect URL, which is specified by the developer. And in this example, we're using NextJS serverless functions inside the API directory on the left-hand side. I'll just zoom in here so you guys can kind of see this. And once our authorization URL is generated by our backend, it's going to direct our user to that authorization screen that we were just talking about. So here we see that, we have this consent screen hosted by the resource owner, Miro in this instance, but again, this could be Google, this could be Zoom, whatever resource, you're authorizing. And once the end user gives their consent, they authorize and install, a call is going to be made once again to our application's backend, or in this specific example, one of our Next.js serverless functions. So here is where we handle the redirect and parse the authorization code from the redirect call that hits an endpoint in our app. I'm going to zoom in here and just kind of focus on breaking down these two parts. So if you recall, we signed in and then we saw that authorization screen in the front end for the user. They authorized, it called our app's callback URL, which in this case is this redirect.js file. And here, what happens first in this top yellow highlighted section is that we're checking to see that the code, the authorization code, was included in that redirect URL after the end user authorized. And if it was, then we're going to make a subsequent request to an OAuth endpoint to exchange that code for an access token. So that's happening in the second part. In the first part, we're taking that code that we parsed on redirect, we're putting it here as a query parameter, and we're calling this OAuth endpoint for our resource owner. And here in the bottom half, we're expecting an access token and a refresh token in the API response from that OAuth endpoint. So we've gone through quite a bit right now, but don't worry if you still have questions. We're going to go through this flow end to end in a real app in just a moment. But first, I want to take a look at some of the benefits and call out why we're using a framework like Next.js. So, Next.js provides us with these serverless functions, and it saves us a bit of time when it comes to, removing the need for setting up a formal server or formal backend. So exactly like you see here on the screen, the serverless functions are, again, a feature of Next.js, and they're included in the API directory that I showed you just a second ago. So this means that these functions allow us to make API requests directly from these .js files within our app. Again, saving us the time of setting up our own server instance. So, in contrast, if we were using a different JavaScript framework, like React, for instance, we would want to leverage an Express server, or something similar to listen and handle this part of our OAuth implementation. These Next.js serverless functions also make it, allow us to more seamlessly save our access tokens directly in like the cookies for the browser, for example, without having to worry about passing things from our backend to our front end to the browser. It just makes things a little bit easier. The same goes for CORS related errors as well. Okay, so, we've walked through most of the foundational aspects of the authorization code flow and added some context around how it's triggered from the front end. Now let's take a closer look at an end-to-end example of generating an access token from our code. So I'm going to shift gears here a little and share my screen. Okay. So here on the left-hand side, we've got our browser open, and on the right-hand side, we've got the same app that we were just walking through. So I'm going to start by just setting up my local environment here. And then I'm going to go to localhost, where I'm hosting this front end. And we can see once again, we've got this basic sign-in button, and I've got my signin.js file open here in my Next.js app. And this function is constructing the authorization URL with the client ID, which is provided by the resource owner, and a redirect URL, which we specify. And in this case, our redirect URL is actually this redirect function within our app. We can see if we go to our .env file, this is where we're specifying our redirect URL. So when a user clicks sign in, it's going to bring us to that authorization page. This was based off of this URL. Some resource owners might have an extra step, but generally it's just it's some kind of install or authorize button. And we can actually see here that an access token and refresh token were successfully generated because we're logging it here in the console. But where and how did we actually get this? So we can see there's not much happening in the front end UI here. It actually all happened on the back end. And it mostly happened here in this redirect.js file. So if we go up to the top here, this is the callback URL that happens after the end user authorizes and is sent to, localhost 3000. It starts by, again, checking that the redirect included a code parameter, and then we're injecting that into a request to an OAuth endpoint, including this as a query parameter. And in the response, we're expecting an access token and a refresh token. And in this instance, we're also using the cookies to store this access token and refresh token. And we're checking for the presence of these tokens to determine whether or not a user already authorized. So if there was an access token if there was an access token and a refresh token, then we're saying they're authenticated. If there was not an access token and a refresh token, then we're saying they're not authenticated. So if they're authenticated, we're not going to see that sign in. But if they are not authenticated, we will see that sign in. And I'm going to show you here in the cookies where we're storing this. So if we refresh the page here, we will see we've got currently an access token and a refresh token. But if we were to delete these, our app would suggest that we need to authorize again because the presence of those cookies is no longer valid. So this is just, again, kind of a high-level overview of how we're using a NextJS app to simplify some of the OAuth flow and really boil it down to just the essentials. But I'm going to shift gears here and go back to our slides to kind of summarize a few of the things we talked about so far. All right, so we've seen that end-to-end flow, but there were a few things that were not covered in this kind of foundational demo that I want to call out. One is, this was a demo for today's purposes, but if this was a production level thing, you would probably want to handle your tokens a bit more securely. So that might involve, encryption, a database, things of this nature that you're probably a bit more familiar with. And also, again, this example uses NextJS serverless functions inside the API folder that I showed you. But an alternative approach or a more typical one might be setting up a formal backend and a server. So something like a Node and Express backend to handle authorization and listen for those requests to the OAuth server. So this is just, a quick demo for today's purposes, but let's take a quick look back at what we covered from an essentials perspective. So we talked about how OAuth is a launching pad for bringing more capabilities into our apps. We talked high level about the different flows, but really focused on the authorization code flow. We did a kind of a front end, back end comparison side by side, and then we generated an access token. So the next step here would be, of course, to make an API request with that access token. Because we were using a Miro example, I could easily make a request to the Miro API with that access token that I showed in the console. But that would be really the next step here. And then you could, of course, take advantage of any of the resources that Miro offers, or Google or Zoom, whatever you're using to incorporate or integrate into your front-end app. And if you want to see the repo that I was sharing here today, you can find it here on our Discord server. And there's a channel for this meetup if you're interested to explore it a bit more. I'm also happy to answer questions offline, but you can also find an on-demand version of this kind of walkthrough today on our YouTube channel. And you can find more information on serverless functions, which we were leveraging in our app if you're interested. And yeah, with that, I will open it up to any kind of discussion or questions.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Will. That was really interesting to hear from you. That's amazing. Does anybody have any questions that you want to ask? Oh.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yep.
Yeah.
Great presentation, Will. Thank you. I wanted to ask about security concerns for storing tokens in the cookies.
Yep. Yeah. So as I mentioned, you probably wouldn't want to do that directly in like a production level app. Or if you did, you would want to make sure that there's some level of encryption. This was mostly just to show you kind of the like very essential parts of the flow of OAuth. And that is one method you could use, but yeah, I completely agree. It wouldn't be probably a production level recommendation.
What is your preference? Which approach do you use usually, if I may ask?
Yeah, I mean, I would use some kind of encryption and probably store that encrypted token in my database, and then pass it to my front end as needed, rather than keeping it in the cookies as we did in today's example.
All right, thank you.
Yeah, no, good question.
Any other questions?
And of course, if anyone thinks of questions afterwards, you can always reach out to me on Discord. And yeah, happy to share any other learnings, as well as you can explore the GitHub repo, which I can drop a link in the chat as well, so that
Oh, brilliant. Thank you.
if you have questions about that, you can also comment directly on the repo.
Excellent. Well, it seems then that all that's left for me to say, once Will's dropped that in the chat, I have sent you all the link for if you want to see the recording of today's session. We usually give it about a week, and then it will be available on YouTube for you, so you can always rewatch. And if you think of any questions, like Will says, please feel free to get in touch with him and he'll be able to chat with you further about that. But thank you so much, Will, for being able and willing to come and share some of what you know. It's always great to hear from people like yourself. So thank you so much for taking the time out to come and speak to us. And thank you everybody who's joined us today and everyone who's watched online as well. It's been really great to have you. I hope you have a very Merry Christmas, because this is our last session, I believe, before the end of the year. So Merry Christmas, everybody. And I will see you all in the new year at our next online event. Thank you so much for coming. Take care.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you. Bye.